Good afternoon. I'm going to just sort of start. We have got a message from Bill Clinton wanted to be able to be with us this week, and he cannot. So he wanted to just wish us a happy birthday, a happy 10th anniversary. So we'll just hear from him.
Congratulations on the 10th anniversary of the Global Philanthropy Forum. What I appreciate about the Global Philanthropy Forum is that its members do not rest on their laurels. Like our Clinton Global Initiative, you're committed to measuring each accomplishment so you can replicate the models that work and learn from those that don't. You've turned good intentions into real, positive changes for people all around the world. Through your efforts, more women have access to capital, more girls are attending schools, more families have access to the health care they need, fewer mothers will die in childbirth, more small businesses will get that needed first loan guarantee, or equity investment. But as you look back on your 10 years of service and look forward to even more years of impact, I hope GPF members will bear two things in mind. One, individuals today have more capacity to make a difference even now than they did when you began. And second, the world needs more of you because there's still more work to be done. The positive and negative forces of interdependence are such that there's a real gap between what's needed and what the private sector can produce or the public sector can provide. That's the breach all of us must step into. Thank you for doing it, and congratulations.
So just a quick snapshot of what we're going to be talking about. There are 5 billion mobile phones being used around the world today, and about 1 billion smartphones that provide for internet connectivity. And so this is, of course, mobile telephony is the primary means of communication in the developing world. So the impact is potentially very, very large. So we're going to be talking about connective technologies during this conversation, but we're going to acknowledge that they can be forces for both for good and for ill. And that all depends on choices that individuals make, the kind of processes they employ, and the kinds of institutions that they build. So there'll be a constant reminder that, A, we have this great opportunity, but B, it'll depend on all of us to use it in a smart way. We're going to have 3 people joining me in this. Andrew Zolli, as you probably all know, is the curator of PopTech, which is an annual gathering where thought leaders come together to talk about the social implications of technology. And so this is the perfect conversation for Andrew. Nick Hughes originally started, when he was back at Vodafone, he started M-Pesa, which many of you know about, and we'll talk a little bit about that means of initially just of transferring money back and forth, it was in Kenya, it was Tanzania, and South Africa, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And he now is the head or the founder of Signal Point Partners, which looks for early investment opportunities particularly in emerging markets, but in this realm as well for mobile service ventures. And then finally, Ken Roth. I think this entire room knows you, Ken. Ken has been the head of the executive director of Human Rights Watch since, I believe it's 1993. Before that, he was a prosecutor in New York, and before that, he worked on the Iran-Contra investigation in Washington, D.C. During his time at Human Rights Watch, I think the organization has grown 8-fold. Partly because of the people in this room, and you're in about 80 countries now. Is that right? Is that right? So Andrew, I'm going to start with you and just ask you: Are we right to refer to the widespread adoption of this kind of technology as representing a turning point, or are we just going with the latest fad?
Yeah, there's no question this is fundamentally a shift, and you can state it sort of simply by the converse, which is that while those numbers are incredibly impressive, you think about more than 2/3, 3/4 of humanity has access to a mobile device. We talk about how to cross the digital divide, and the reality is we're crossing that divide. For all of the work that's left to do, and there's some very substantial work left to do, you wouldn't have to add a single piece of infrastructure to that platform today to see a transformational economic, social justice, social innovation revolution that dwarfs what we've seen on the internet thus far. You literally don't have to add another device. And there's so much critical mass there now that what you're seeing, I think what is incredibly exciting is the way in which these technologies, the extant technologies, old technologies like SMS, you don't have to get smartphones to get a tremendous amount of extraordinary innovation out of the platform we've already got, and the ways in which we're mashing it up, connecting it to each other, extending it beyond that network. We have seen just the very, very beginnings of what's to come.
So if you turn on the tube anytime, on any channel, you'll be focusing in part on what has been happening in North Africa, Ken, and in the Gulf as well. Some folks have attributed all that has occurred, or a good deal of what has occurred, to the fact of connective technology. So the notion that absent Facebook, this could not have happened. Say something about the real role of technology in all this.
Okay. Well, first of all, Jane, let me put this in context. People matter. It's not only about technology. And so, even the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt were very people dependent. So I don't want to excise them from the picture. That said, technology also matters. And just to make a historical point for a moment, the human rights movement is the product of communication technology. If you think about how we started, the only things we could deal with were kind of big, long-term issues like slavery or women's suffrage, because they were there for the long term. You could mobilize around them without having day-to-day information about what was going on. It took really the emergence of, initially the phone, ready access to international phone calls, to create the modern human rights movement. In Amnesty's early days, they would, write letters, dear so-and-so, is your son still in prison? They'd mail it. A month later, they would get the answer, and they would then, be able to launch a campaign. Obviously, the development of, initially the fax, which allowed, paper to be conveyed, not just the word, at a much less expensive rate. Then email. Each step of the way has, facilitated a different kind of access to information and a different kind of organizing. And I think it's safe to say that things like the Holocaust or the Khmer Rouge slaughter would not have happened if we had modern communication technology, because the governments responsible needed to be able to cover up what they were doing. Even back then, you couldn't commit mass murder openly. You needed to hide it. So the technology has been transformative. Now, what about Middle East and North Africa today? I think that Facebook and Twitter made an enormous difference. And let me focus on Facebook for a second. Classically, a revolution was led by, the vanguard, by a leadership. And the problem with a leadership is it could be decapitated. The government can come in and just arrest a few people and significantly shut down the movement. You then kind of had the emergence of NGOs. NGOs, too, there are a few individuals who matter. NGOs can be harassed. So, for example, after the color revolutions of a few years ago, which were seen as led by NGOs, governments responded by, bureaucratic harassment. Facebook allowed a leaderless revolution. Not really leaderless. We know there were actually leaders there who spent a lot of time studying, for example, what Otpor did in Belgrade, or they were very consciously learning about how to mount a nonviolent revolution. But they were able to maintain a low profile by using Facebook. Facebook also allowed people to stand up and be counted without literally standing up. It allowed people to say, yeah, I'll go to that demonstration without going yet. And they could develop a sense of safety in numbers by seeing large numbers of people make that same commitment. So suddenly they got the nerve to genuinely go. The fact that Facebook has pictures on it was, in Libya, for example, incredibly important for people's self-confidence. They all knew they were being monitored by the state. But the fact that more and more people were putting their face on this commitment to ultimately go to the streets gave people a sense of freedom. They felt that this would be possible to do. Once you had the revolution, things like Twitter were incredibly important for allowing the crowds to outfox the police. If the police were attacking here, the crowds could be mobilized very quickly. It allowed people to get word to us. We had people both in Tahrir Square but also on the outside. And so in real time, we could hear about how the army was letting these thugs attack the demonstrators and get word within an hour to the White House so that they would then call Suleiman, the vice president who was kind of running things in Egypt, and say, what are you doing? You got to rein in these thugs. What's the army doing there? And so there was this kind of immediate feedback that was possible because of people sitting there with their mobile devices plugged into Twitter, and we could get the word out very quickly. It was also much better than classic email or SMS because there you're limited by your list. With Twitter, anybody who wants to follow you can follow you. And so it just kind of opened up communication channels in a way that were not available previously. Now, it's not all good, and we can get into that. There are limits to this. But it made a huge difference in how these revolutions unfolded.
Mm-hmm. Now, part of what this was about, Nick, was here you had a situation in both Tunisia and in Egypt where inflation was going up, unemployment rates were going up, food prices were going up, and the only thing going down was the quality of living for most people. Say something about the ways in which the private sector, employing these technologies, can provide services that aren't otherwise being provided.
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me along to your conference. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about mobile technology. And just to sort of build on your introduction, the 5 billion phones that we know are out there today, many of those are in the hands of people who have previously been invisible to service providers, whether it's financial services or agricultural services or health services. They've been off the radar, and yet now we have this point of connectivity with them, and that person may be on low income, they may be very far from urban areas, but we now actually have an existing infrastructure to reach them. And when you have that point of connectivity, I think you start to be able to sort of look towards productivity. And certainly the world in which I've operated for the last 8 years has suddenly realized that you have this vast untapped platform which we can start to layer much more services than voice on, which will allow people to sort of create wealth, create employment, and drive economic activity. I think the proof point of this is M-Pesa in Kenya. I'm sure many people in the room know what M-Pesa is, but a sort of 30-second version of it. What we provided over the mobile channel is a virtual wallet that lets people load cash in at one point, turn it into electronic money, and then move it across, and it can be cashed out somewhere else. Very simply, that's all M-Pesa does. It's quite simple technology, actually. But it hit this sweet spot in the market, and over the space of 4 years, we've now got 13.5 million people using it every day. That's more than 50% of the adult population, moving money around in vast volumes in terms of numbers of transactions, but in very small transaction sizes. And the impact of that has been quite astonishing in Kenya. More than $200 million every day moves in small transactions. That's an astonishing number. And we think about, well, what's that doing in the economy? Well, that's certainly helping small businessmen pay suppliers. It's helping wage earners in cities send money back home to their parents or to their family. It's helping people move that value away from cash and store it as electronic value, which is now widely recognized as something people on low income try to do. Quite
because it's safe.
Because it's safe, and there's no temptation to use that cash for something else. And so, we're Signal Point certainly passionate about this opportunity. We think, your point, Andrew, you don't actually need to do much more. The infrastructure's there, the devices are in people's hands, and it isn't about the smart technology. It's more about the services that technology can enable. And that's certainly a very exciting space for us.
And how does this contribute also to good governance? I mean, people being actually aware of what services are available to them, that kind of transparency.
Yeah, I mean, just to link back to some of the troubles we've seen in North Africa and the Middle East recently. In 2007, 2008, there was a lot of political tension in Kenya, and we had M-Pesa up and was running it, and it had a relatively small customer base of around 1 million. But after the election, there were some riots, and the country closed down. Buses weren't running. Taxis just didn't exist anymore. The Matatu buses, which any of you have been to Nairobi, the streets are full of these buses, just disappeared. So there was a lockdown happening, and we saw this spike in the number of people sending money across distances using M-Pesa, and that was because of the utility and the reach of that mobile service. So I think it sort of helps in difficult situations, and I think on balance, the sort of positive impact of it is far outweighs some of the sort of negative uses that we know about and we hear about.
When we think about, I started with the whole question about employment, we think about what creates jobs in this day and age, and it's small businesses, right? Small and growing businesses. Say something about how quickly can a Kenyan or someone in Afghanistan stand up a business in which, in essence, their website is their office and all the business is done online. How quickly can you turn transform yourself into being a business person?
Yeah, well actually, we often fall, in the Western world, we fall into this trap of thinking there's a sort of a consumer, an individual that we serve, and a business we serve. But in many of these economies, that line between a consumer and a business or an enterprise is blurred. Because somebody is a consumer, but they're also running their own little business, and perhaps they employ 2 or 3 other people. And so I think we've got to be creative about the services we offer those customers. And so certainly we know what M-Pesa is being used for. We can start to build the next wave of services that build on a basic transaction engine, so helping with business finance, being able to provide short-term lines of credit, relatively small credits. This is what we're starting to see the mainstream financial service providers in Kenya use the channel for. And so I think there's going to be a change in the types of things that we're seeing delivered over the mobile from the mainstream providers. At the moment, it's just used as a channel, largely used as a channel, P2P. I'll send you some money and you can cash it out or pay a bill. But I think we will see the emergence of services which are redesigned at the core level for mobiles, and especially excited about small to medium-sized enterprise services, helping with accounting, playing supply chains, factoring on invoices. There's so many things that we could be getting into using this low-cost way of moving funds around quickly between a business and between a consumer.
Yeah, and the key here is that it's low cost. I'm just going to ask Ken a question and go back to you, Andrew. Ken, this may be just as much, North Africa may be just as much a story about dignity as it is about technology. Say something about Mohamed Wazizi, the 26-year-old in Tunisia that was a college graduate, wasn't able to get a job, started a fruit stand.
No, I mean, exactly. I think the story is well known, and that he had a fruit stand. He was regularly harassed by the police. There was an incident where, allegedly a policewoman slapped him when he refused to pay a bribe. He later in the day immolated himself in front of a police station, and that sparked the Tunisian Revolution, which in turn sparked the revolutions elsewhere. I think your bottom line point is...
Why do people so identify with that moment?
Well,
he suddenly was the face of...
Yeah, I think that, what you have, Tunisia, you have a very well-educated population that had expectations of advancement that were being frustrated by a still relatively stifled economic system, and a political system that was completely stultified. And so that, it is that combination of growing expectations and an economy and a political system unable to meet them that lies behind this growing frustration. And it's a frustration that is felt probably most acutely by young people who come out of their schooling and don't have the future they had been led to believe they might have. And so that is, I think, why the environment was ripe for an uprising in many of these places. But frankly, even in countries where they may be better off economically, say in Bahrain, the lack of the ability to participate politically is also what's driving a lot of this.
Andrew, help us think about the very educated but unemployable. We tend to think about those who need an education in order to enter into political life or economic life. What about the highly educated?
Yeah, it's fascinating. You think about the story you just asked Ken about, and of course it could almost not have been otherwise. That is to say, the apparatus of the state is designed to skim off potential threats who are political organizers. There's no way to protect the apparatus of the state against someone who wants to immolate themselves symbolically because of their humiliation, because of their lack of possibility. And so I think that's that yoked to the fact that we've turned every human into a media company because we put trillions of dollars of software and distribution capacity at the end of every pipe, at least if it's open. I think the thing that's particularly interesting about the moment that we're in now, to leave that story aside for a moment, is, and this is to pick up a little bit on what you said, is where the next set of opportunities come from on top of this platform. In a place like Saudi Arabia, the official unemployment rate for college-educated men is 44%. The official statistics. The unofficial statistics are obviously much higher. We're used to an environment in which we correlate access to education with economic development. There you actually see correlative behaviors that we associate with poverty because there's no opportunity for structural advancement. But what I wanted to mention to sort of pick up on this theme is just 2 or 3 really quick ideas for things that happen once this mobile connectivity platform is in place. One of them is we're going to see radically new approaches to tackling some extant problems. One perfect example, we were talking earlier about the challenges for smallholder farmers. In Kenya, there's an extraordinary program everybody here should know about called Kilimo Salama, which is smallholder insurance purchased on M-Pesa among 1-acre farmers. That when you purchase that contract as a farmer, the weather activity in your very, very local region is monitored by a wireless weather station that's connected to the wireless base station that provides mobile connectivity in your area. And the moment that there's an adverse weather event, you receive a payout on your mobile device, which closes the timeliness gap for those kinds of products. So this is an entirely new category of delivering, in this case, insurance products to an entirely new cohort that was not efficiently serviceable prior to that platform being in place. So what happens is this extraordinary thing becomes the platform for a whole set of other extraordinary things. A second one that I'll mention is many of us in this room care about public health issues in classic high disease burden, low resource settings, where you don't have enough healthcare workers to tackle the ambient problem of huge percentages of the population with HIV, TB, malaria. You think about the natural exposure issues, and many of us are thinking about how do we empower the public health workers. I was talking to some folks here about that. Well, even if we quadruple the number of the productivity of the public health sector in many of these communities, we will come nowhere near to being able to tackle these challenges. The future, as some of our work, what we've seen, is the combination of mass mobile messaging to drive behavioral change, combined with distributed low-cost healthcare diagnostics to enable people to self-serve, to begin behavioral change in the field, supported with messaging that's 1 or 2 directional, to connect people to the public health system in ways that they've never been connected before. And you can look right down the chain at whether it's improving the resilience of at-risk communities who are thinking about it, who we're trying to think about adaptation to climate change, to mobilizing mass behavioral change in at-risk communities that are exposed to significant healthcare risks. Those kinds of things are going to migrate to this platform because in the future, it's ambient infrastructure. It's a huge tool that none of us have to pay for anymore. We don't have to pay for the base stations, we don't have to pay for the towers, and we don't have to pay for the transactional costs of moving money around the system anymore. That is a gold mine of opportunity for the shared concerns of this room.
So Nick, you're investing in some of these healthcare enterprises. Say something about it.
Yeah, sure. Actually, there's a more fundamental point as well. About, I'm a strong believer in the fact that these schemes and initiatives, they have to be commercially viable at the end of the day. Otherwise, the scale issue doesn't come in. Yeah. When you're looking at a mobile service, it's all about scale, because the great thing about mobiles is you can price discreetly for every individual consumer. You can keep the costs very low, but the economics don't work unless you get to 100,000 people or 200,000 people. Yeah. So it becomes a scale issue. And that in turn, if you look back, well, how do we deliver scale? And that's where I think there's a really exciting opportunity for the private sector to come in. Now, the challenge is, it's not core business, it's still quite high risk, it's very early stage in terms of where we are in the market dynamics. It's a well-known story, but the original funding for M-Pesa didn't come from Vodafone. I tried really hard to get the chief operating officer at the time to give me some money for a fund, and he said, no, there's no way, you can't tell me the business case. I don't understand the regulatory issues, which are very complex, and it's just not going to happen. But I managed to get some funding from a UK government DFID challenge fund. That was enough for me to put a pilot together and to walk back into that guy's office 1 year later and say, look, this is what I'm talking about, and this is the product. And certainly Michael Joseph, who's the chief executive in Kenya at the time, as soon as he saw the product, it's a different conversation because you don't have to do that sort of convincing. That's a challenge really, because how do you? It's great having sort of 1,000 flowers bloom, lots of nice, interesting little pilot-sized examples of mobile technology, but real change will only come when we drive scale, and we need to be thinking like the private sector and being able to get up to that point.
Yeah. So, Andrew, I'm going to take you back. You were sort of squirming, so you wanted to talk about scale, which...
Yeah, and I think there's a couple other things that I'm sorry, that was probably not fun to watch a fat Italian guy squirm. I'm very sorry for all of you.
I didn't see it.
Thanks. He was spared. I think there's another really amazing opportunity here. I totally agree about scale. And just to give you a sense of something that goes directly to addressing non-market inclusive or non-market driven issues that the philanthropic sector cares about. Here's a perfect example. Ned Breslin, who's the CEO of a fantastic organization called Water for People, really amazing leader in that space, recently told me and some other people that after 5 years, their audit is that 60% of the wells that they've built don't work. 60%. So you think about the enormous waste that goes into trying to tackle a core issue of interest to this room, which is access to clean water. So they built this unbelievable platform, which you can see at their website, called Flow, which is Field Level Operation Watch. It's an automated mobile platform that they're now using in 60,000 communities, among 60,000 water sources, to measure the field level activity of their wells that they build when they do site visits, and then they mash them up into a sort of an aggregated Google map. This kind of tool suggests one of the two really important themes for philanthropy. One is we're going to be producing a lot of data in real time for the first time ever to actually see whether the behavioral change models or the interventions that we work actually work. Terrifying many people in the space, I guarantee you. But on top of that, it's not just the analysis of whether what we're doing is effective. It's that for the first time, the data about whether that thing worked that we did, the data exhaust, as it's referred to, is going to be a primary asset that we can open source, remix, do all kinds of deep mashup analytics on top of, and the ability to push the data out into the field suggests that even when we fail, the precise data about why and how we failed is going to have enormous value. Where we live in silos of excellence. The water people don't talk to the public health people don't talk. Everyone complains about that. Well, the data may do the talking for us in the future, and that comes from having this platform that's disaggregated and kind of pushed through.
Yeah, it's probably the biggest form of crowdsourcing is collecting that data off mobile network operators.
Absolutely. Ken, in this world of sort of a quick feedback loops and transparency, because we can all see the data, is this going to make governments more accountable or simply more fragile?
Well, it cuts both ways. I mean, if you look, one of the most interesting things that I saw was just after the Egyptian and the Tunisian revolutions, which clearly had, a major role for social media, the Syrian government, for the first time, welcomed in Facebook and YouTube. Now, what was that about? They figured, which is correct, that not only do these technologies allow people to mobilize, they also allow the government to monitor people. And Assad made a bet. He said, I can pick off the leadership, pick off the participants faster than they can proliferate. Now, Assad lost that bet. It turned out that, social media can proliferate faster than secret police can. But it's not always like that, because the counterexample is China. Many of you are aware that the Tunisian revolution was called the Jasmine Revolution. So in China, there has been a call for jasmine rallies. And people are smart enough to know that you're not going to just go picketing down the street and expect to survive for very long. So there's been a call in a series of cities every Sunday afternoon for people to stroll up and down the street in the kind of market center, at the shopping mall or whatever. And it's that way the police don't quite know who is who, and it's a very subversive way of having a demonstration. Now, this has terrified the Chinese police. I mean, China, many people don't realize that it has, according to the government's own statistics, between 80 and 90,000 incidents of public unrest every year. And what terrifies the government more than anything else is that these local protests, mostly directed against corrupt local officials, will link together and they'll have another national Tiananmen-style uprising. So the Chinese government is devoting kind of massive resources to preventing these Jasmine rallies, which are a national effort. Now, in the case of China, given the resources available to the government, so far the police have proliferated faster than the social media users. But I wouldn't bet on them for the long term. And so that is, that is, we're talking about scale. That is one of the great, the fact that social media allows movement to scale so quickly does make it something that in the end I think will hold governments accountable, even though the governments are determined to hold the people accountable. And to use this as a way of kind of cracking down.
Didn't the U.S. ambassador, wasn't he found strolling, and he said he was just strolling?
I was just shopping, which is what everybody says, But I really shouldn't, I shouldn't minimize this. The Chinese government today is in the process of cracking down in a way that we have not seen in more than a decade. And it is, picking off lawyers, dissidents, bloggers, you name it, and giving them serious prison sentences. And they are so scared. And the irony is, people think of China in the world as this, powerful, rising society. But if you look at China at home, the government is scared and brittle. Yeah. And it is, I think we are in a moment where this is not sustainable. Either the government has to figure out a way to make itself more accountable in a gradual reformist way, or it is going to face some kind of second Tiananmen.
And the method for monitoring internet traffic, isn't that just people what is their method in China?
Well, that's the thing. At some point it does take people. Now, I don't know who all here is from. Massive numbers of people. Now, the Chinese government is devoting the resources. They have the resources. They're devoting that. One of the interesting dilemmas facing internet companies is, what responsibility do you have when you operate in a place like China? And the two places where this comes up is, government requests for censorship and government requests for user ID. And the way the Chinese government used to do this, it's too embarrassing for them to say, here's the prohibited list of topics, don't allow any searches on those. So instead, they'll sort of go up to a search company and say, behave. And you'll say, what do you mean? And so basically, the internet company has to probe the Chinese firewall, figure out what's being censored, and then censor a little bit more to stay out of trouble. Now, the counter to this is something that was developed with NGOs, including Human Rights Watch, and Microsoft, Yahoo, and Google. And it's called Global Network Initiative. And in essence, what it does is it requires the internet companies not to make it easy for the Chinese or comparable authoritarian governments, insisting that the government provide written instructions, that it cite a law. It doesn't preclude going along with the censorship, but it makes it hard. And Google now has gone a step further and said, we're just not going to censor, period. Now, the difficulty is that Facebook, Twitter, they have not signed on to the Global Network Initiative. They have not even announced publicly what are the rules governing when they're asked to censor or when they're asked to turn over user ID. And that's unfortunate. It means the users don't know what to expect. It means that they're much weaker when it comes to confronting the government because they can't even cite a publicly announced policy. They're just really, completely vulnerable to demands from governments. And so even though, Twitter will say, or we don't operate in China, they don't operate there physically, but they certainly are dependent on, people use it in China all the time, And they, the question is it going to be easy or hard to get access, to get around the Chinese firewall and to get access to sites like Twitter? So there is a real need for companies to think about their social responsibility. And particularly some of these companies are new and they say, oh, we're really not developed enough to have a policy in this area, and that's just not the case. I think we've got to kind of convince them that it is time to think about these broader political questions.
We always tell ourselves, at least, that if you want to survive in the global economy, you can't afford to shut down the internet. Is China the exception to that, or is it, or back to your thought that this isn't sustainable?
Well, what's been fast? I mean, if you look at Syria, Libya. I don't know how many of you have seen the chart of Libya where you can actually watch internet usage, and there's a chart going like this, and then zoop, like that, and it just drops when they turn off the internet. Now, what we've learned is, and Egypt learned this very quickly, it's an economic disaster to shut off the internet. Today's modern economy needs the internet. It's also a huge problem for the security forces because they communicate on the same mobile networks and the same email and everything else. And so suddenly, they don't run around with walkie-talkies anymore. I mean, they use modern communication too. And so they can't communicate with each other. And so, all of this is double-edged, but in very interesting ways. And so while, China, they have not just shut off the internet. They've tried to, contain the internet and to try to prevent access to information, which is, works to a certain extent, but people are very creative in working around the firewall and various tools like that. And I think, anytime you're trying to prevent the movement of something as, mobile as information, the censor is in a losing game. And so I don't think that, shutting off the technology is a long-term solution.
I just add two things to the China story, just to give you a sense of how complex and weird this situation is. There are services in China where censorship is a for-fee value-added service. So I'm blogging, and I don't want to be arrested. So for an extra $1 a month, would you please read my posts and make sure that I don't run afoul of the authorities? I think the thing that's interesting about the China case in particular, yeah, is that weird? Is that we tend to think about the Great Firewall of China, and we think that we're sitting in this lovely tabernacle of freedom, and the people on the other side are desperate to get over, and the metaphor is they're cunningly coming up with ways to tunnel their way through, to go up and over and around, and all that's true. But going back to what happened in Tunisia, what was happening in Tunisia was a domestic issue. And the thing that's happening in China is domestic. You look at IYY, who some of you know is an extraordinary artist and sort of living embodiment of freedom, who's recently been disappeared by the government. What triggered that action by the government was not his ability to get out and see the world. I mean, he's all over the planet. He's a global citizen. What triggered that work was criticism and trying to unearth what had happened in Sichuan province in the wake of the earthquake. And that, in turn, threatened to expose corruption at the local level. And you push that system long enough and you're gone. And I think the thing that happens is that we have to think about it as it's absolutely, everything is totally right. But the triggering events for these kinds of activities, I think of China as an Alka-Seltzer dropped in the water. It's a big one. It will eventually fizz to a nice, happy state. It will take a lot longer than other places because of the way it's engineered. But I think the thing that's so interesting about that particular story is that the chapters that are going to push the system backwards are, I think, largely going to be domestic issues. They're going to be issues of I'm trying to get to watch Britney Spears, and I can't get there, right? Or I can't learn about Tiananmen. It's going to be, I want to find out what happened in Sichuan.